The sun was setting over the quiet streets of the city as Malcolm Tate drove home from a late meeting. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the last traces of daylight bleeding into the horizon. The smooth hum of his truck's engine filled the cab, and for the first time all day, he allowed himself to relax. Until he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, red and blue. His stomach tightened. Not again. He flicked on his blinker and pulled over, exhaling as he put both hands on the wheel. He had been through this before. He knew the routine. The squad car rolled to a stop behind him, its headlights blinding. Malcolm glanced at the side mirror. The officer was already out of his car, approaching fast. His posture, his stride, it wasn't right. This wasn't a routine stop. Malcolm knew that walk. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Predatory, looking for an excuse. Then he saw the name tag. Sergeant Ray Danning. Damn, Danning had a reputation. A cop with a history of roughing up black men, of making them disappear into the system for a night, just to remind them who had the power. Malcolm had never personally run into him before, but he knew his type. Danning stopped at the window, hand already resting on his gun. License and registration, he barked. No greeting, no explanation. Malcolm stayed still, keeping his hands on the wheel. Can I ask why I was pulled over, officer? Danning's smirk was small, condescending. You match the description. Of course. Malcolm didn't react. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing frustration cross his face. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately. His wallet was in the cup holder. He lifted one hand off the wheel, slowly, and retrieved it, pulling out his license along with his military ID. Danning's eyes flicked to it, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second. Malcolm saw it, the recognition. Then Danning's smirk returned, and something sharper edged into his gaze. A Marine, huh? He tossed the ID back into the truck. Guess that didn't teach you to follow orders. Malcolm clenched his jaw. Danning tapped the roof of the truck. Step out of the vehicle. Now it was Malcolm's turn to hesitate. For what? He asked, keeping his voice measured. Danning grinned. Because I said so. Malcolm exhaled through his nose. He could argue, he could push back, but he knew how that would end. So, he stepped out. The second his boots hit the pavement, Danning was on him. Rough hands patted him down, pushing him forward against the truck. Spread your legs, Danning ordered. Malcolm didn't resist, didn't move. He stood still, his heartbeat slow and steady, waiting for this to end. Then Danning muttered, just low enough for only Malcolm to hear, You think that uniform makes you special? Out here, you're just another... Hey! The voice cut through the tension like a blade. Danning froze. Malcolm turned his head slightly, catching sight of a woman standing a few feet away, phone raised. She was recording. Danning straightened. Ma'am, I suggest you let this man go, she snapped, or I'll make sure this video gets seen by every news station in the damn country. Malcolm felt the shift. The power dynamic changed in an instant. Danning hesitated. He knew what this meant. The video was already recording. The world was already watching. He had two choices, escalate or back off. For a long moment, Malcolm wasn't sure which one he'd choose. Then, without another word, Danning jerked Malcolm's hands forward, unclipping the cuffs from his belt. Watch yourself, Tate, he muttered under his breath. And just like that, it was over. Malcolm took a slow breath as Danning turned and walked away, climbing back into his patrol car and pulling off, tires screeching against the pavement. The woman lowered her phone, exhaling hard. You okay? She asked. Malcolm nodded. Yeah. She studied him. That cop... I know, Malcolm said. He's been doing this for years. She smirked, holding up her phone. Not anymore. And Malcolm realized right then that this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The video hit the internet like wildfire. Within hours, it had been shared across social media platforms, racking up thousands of comments, retweets, and angry reactions. By morning, it was trending nationally, with headlines screaming across every major news outlet. Black veteran harassed by cop in shocking video. Marine veteran pulled over for matching the description, caught on camera. Sergeant Danning accused of racial profiling, Again. Malcolm Tate wasn't the first man this had happened to, but now the world was watching. He sat in his kitchen, staring at his phone as messages flooded in, some from old friends in the Marines offering support, some from complete strangers thanking him for his service, apologizing for what happened, and some, too many, were from other black men and veterans with similar stories. His hands curled around the coffee cup in front of him. This was bigger than him now. His phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. The name Jordan Ellis flashed across the screen. He answered on the first ring. "Ellis." "Malcolm, you ready for this?" Her voice was sharp, urgent. She had been one of the first lawyers to reach out, and after reading up on her record, Malcolm had agreed to let her take the lead. "Depends," he said. "What am I getting ready for?" "You're going on TV," Jordan replied. "Tonight." Malcolm pinched the bridge of his nose. "I don't." "Listen to me," Jordan cut him off. "The department put out a statement this morning calling the video misleading. They're trying to downplay it. They're hoping people forget by next week." Malcolm exhaled slowly. Of course they were. "I need you to go on air and tell your side," Jordan said. "They don't get to control this narrative. You do." There was a long pause before Malcolm spoke. "All right, let's do it." The studio was colder than he expected. Bright lights beamed down onto the stage, illuminating the sleek news desk where Malcolm now sat, his posture straight, his hands resting loosely in his lap. Across from him was Janine Harris, a well-known anchor with a reputation for pressing tough questions. She folded her hands together, offering him a small, professional smile. "Mr. Tate, first of all, I want to thank you for your service." Malcolm nodded, but he didn't speak. He had a feeling that was just the warm-up. Janine adjusted her earpiece. "So, you're here because of the video that's taken over the internet. You were pulled over by Sergeant Danning. He detained you without cause. But according to the police department's statement, they claim this was all a misunderstanding, that you were, quote, briefly questioned as part of an active investigation and released without incident." She lifted a brow. "What do you say to that?" Malcolm exhaled through his nose, choosing his words carefully. "I say that's exactly what they always say." Janine tilted her head. Meaning, I didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't a suspect. I was a black man driving home. And when Danning pulled me over, he wasn't questioning me. He was looking for an excuse to escalate." Janine's expression turned serious. "Some critics online have suggested that you should have just complied, and this wouldn't have been an issue." Malcolm let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's what people always say, right? Just comply. Just follow orders. That's what Philando Castile did. That's what so many others did. And they still ended up dead." The audience went completely silent. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice steady. "The problem isn't compliance. The problem is the assumption that people like me are threats before we even speak." Janine let the weight of his words settle before asking, "What do you want to happen next?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "I want accountability." His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it. "I want Sergeant Danning fired. I want an independent review board for officers with multiple complaints. I want body cams that can't be turned off when it's convenient. And most of all, I want veterans like me, black veterans, to be treated with the same respect we gave this country." Janine nodded slowly. "And if none of that happens?" Malcolm sat back, his gaze unflinching. "Then they better get used to seeing me because I'm not going anywhere." The interview aired that night. By morning, everything had changed. The police department was flooded with calls and emails from furious citizens, veterans organizations, and civil rights groups. Danning's name was trending online for all the wrong reasons. And then the first real crack appeared. Detective Sarah Knox, a high-ranking officer in the department, had seen enough. The morning after Malcolm's interview, she walked into her captain's office and dropped a thick folder on his desk. It was a record of every complaint against Danning in the last 10 years. 15 accusations of racial profiling, 7 excessive force complaints, 3 officers who had requested transfers just to avoid working with him. The captain's face turned pale as he flipped through the pages. Knox folded her arms. "How many more videos do you think are out there, sir? How many more people do you think he's done this to?" The captain clenched his jaw. She pressed on. "You think the department's reputation is bad now? Imagine what happens when this file gets leaked. A long silence. Then the captain picked up the phone. That afternoon, an official statement was released. The police department announced that Sergeant Danning had been placed on immediate unpaid leave pending an internal investigation. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. And Malcolm? He wasn't done yet, not even close. The morning after the announcement that Sergeant Danning had been placed on unpaid leave, Malcolm Tate woke up to a storm of messages. His phone had been buzzing since before sunrise. Calls from reporters, texts from people he hadn't spoken to in years, emails from veterans organizations offering their support. But he ignored all of it. Instead, he brewed a pot of coffee, sat at his small kitchen table, and turned on the news. The first thing he saw was Danning's face, plastered across the screen. The news anchor's voice was tense as she spoke. Following a viral video that led to national outrage, the Metropolitan Police Department has placed Sergeant Ray Danning on unpaid leave pending an internal investigation. Sources inside the department suggest that this may be just the beginning of legal troubles for Danning as new allegations of misconduct have surfaced. Malcolm exhaled. Good, let it all come out. As he sipped his coffee, the segment continued. In a shocking development, several individuals have come forward claiming they too were harassed, racially profiled, or wrongfully detained by Sergeant Danning over the years. Among them is David Carter, a local teacher and Army veteran who alleges that Danning falsely accused him of theft during a traffic stop 2 years ago. The camera cut to a man in his late 40s, his face tense. I didn't file a complaint because I knew nothing would happen, Carter said. But now the world is watching, and I refuse to stay quiet. Malcolm felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. His phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. Jordan Ellis. He answered. You're up early. Jordan's voice was sharp, urgent. Turn to channel 4. Malcolm switched channels, and there, standing behind a podium flanked by uniformed officers, was the police chief. We take these allegations very seriously, the chief was saying. Sergeant Danning has been placed on unpaid leave while our internal investigation continues. We are fully cooperating with external agencies to ensure transparency and accountability. Malcolm snorted. Lies. All of it. Jordan's voice cut through his thoughts. They're panicking. You see it? I see it. They're scrambling. They don't want to fire him because that means admitting fault, but they also can't protect him anymore. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. What's our next move? Jordan didn't hesitate. We sue. Malcolm's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. He knew it was coming. He had seen it in Jordan's eyes the last time they spoke. I need you to be sure about this, Jordan continued. Once we go down this road, it's war. The department will fight us. The police union will fight us. The city will try to bury us in legal red tape. They will dig into your past, into every mistake you've ever made. They'll try to make you the villain. Malcolm's jaw clenched. They already tried that, he said. Jordan was quiet for a moment. Yeah, and it didn't work. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. He thought about the men like David Carter, the ones who never came forward because they thought it wouldn't matter. He thought about every veteran who had put their life on the line, only to come home and be treated like a criminal in their own country. He thought about the next black man Danning would pull over if no one stopped him. We sue, Malcolm said. And just like that, the war began. By the time Malcolm and Jordan officially filed the lawsuit, the media frenzy had exploded into something bigger than either of them expected. The lawsuit wasn't just about Malcolm anymore. It was about every person Danning had abused over the years. With Jordan leading the charge, the case named not just Danning, but the entire police department, accusing them of racial profiling, abuse of power, and failure to discipline officers with repeated misconduct complaints. The city tried to dismiss it immediately, but then Detective Sarah Knox made her move. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. She wasn't supposed to get involved, she knew that, but she had spent years watching officers like Danning get away with everything. So she did what she had to do. She leaked the files. Every single complaint against Danning. Every case where he was accused of excessive force but faced no punishment. every internal report where superiors covered for him. The documents landed in the hands of Lisa Carter, the journalist who had first recorded Malcolm's traffic stop. Within hours, she published a scathing article, "A Culture of Corruption: How the Metropolitan Police Department Protected Sergeant Ray Danning." The fallout was immediate. The police department couldn't control the narrative anymore. The mayor's office was forced to hold a press conference, announcing that Danning was no longer just on unpaid leave. He was officially under federal investigation. Then came the biggest bombshell. The Department of Justice announced that they were launching a full civil rights investigation into the Metropolitan Police Department. Malcolm watched the announcement from his lawyer's office. Jordan turned to him, a rare smile on her face. "We did it." Malcolm exhaled slowly. He thought about the day he had been pulled over, the way Danning had smirked at him, the way he had spoken to him like he was nothing. That man had thought he could get away with it. He had thought Malcolm was just another black man to push around. Now he was a cautionary tale. Malcolm wasn't a victim anymore. He was the reason things were about to change, and Danning never saw it coming. The courthouse was packed. The air buzzed with tension as journalists, activists, and community members crowded the rows, all waiting for the verdict. Cameras lined the back of the room, their blinking red lights capturing every moment, every breath. Malcolm Tate sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. He had been in tense situations before: combat zones, high-stakes negotiations, life or death situations that made the world tilt. But this was a different kind of battlefield. Jordan Ellis sat beside him, flipping through her notes with the cool precision of a woman who already knew how this was going to end. Across from them, the city's legal team sat stiffly in their seats, their confidence long since cracked. And in the middle of it all, sitting without a badge, without a uniform, stripped of his power, was Ray Danning. He looked nothing like the man Malcolm had encountered that night. His cocky smirk was gone. The arrogance that had dripped from his voice when he had pressed Malcolm against his truck, mocking his service, throwing his ID on the ground like it meant nothing. Gone. Now he sat there, his shoulders hunched, his jaw tight, his lawyer murmuring something in his ear that he barely seemed to hear. The judge cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "In the case of Tate versus the Metropolitan Police Department," he began, adjusting his glasses as he read from the document in front of him, "the court finds that the defendant, Sergeant Ray Danning, engaged in unlawful racial profiling, wrongful detention, and excessive force." Malcolm's fingers tightened just slightly, the only sign that he had even heard the words. "The court orders that the Metropolitan Police Department pay damages in the amount of $3.5 million to the plaintiff," the judge continued, his voice even, unwavering. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The press scrambled to type, to send the headline out before anyone else. But the judge wasn't finished. "In addition," he said, his gaze sweeping toward the city's legal team, "this court recommends immediate disciplinary action against Sergeant Danning, including termination and the permanent revocation of his ability to serve in any law enforcement capacity." That's when Danning finally reacted. His hands slammed onto the table, his face twisted with barely contained rage. "You can't do this," he hissed, his voice low but furious. "I served this city for 20 damn years." The judge didn't flinch. "And yet, Mr. Tate served this country," he said, "and you saw fit to treat him like a criminal." Danning opened his mouth to argue, but his lawyer grabbed his arm, shaking his head. The message was clear. It was over. Malcolm sat still as the gavel struck wood, sealing the decision. Just like that, the fight that had started on a dark roadside months ago had come to its final moment, and he had won. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. The second Malcolm stepped outside, the roar of voices hit him. Cheers, applause, people chanting his name. Lisa Carter stood among them, her phone raised, live streaming the moment. Jordan nudged him. "You ready for this?" Malcolm exhaled. "Not really." She smirked. "Too bad." A reporter shoved a microphone toward him. "Mr. Tate, what does this victory mean to you?" Malcolm paused. What did it mean? He glanced at the faces in the crowd. Other black men who had been profiled, veterans who had been disrespected, families who had lost loved ones to police violence. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. He turned back to the cameras. "It means the fight's not over," he said, his voice steady. "Danning was one cop, one man, but the system that protected him, that let him get away with this for years, that's still standing." The crowd quieted, listening. "I didn't file this lawsuit for money," Malcolm continued. "I filed it because I was tired. Tired of watching men like me get pushed down, disrespected, harassed, and treated like criminals just for existing." He turned toward the reporters. "I want this city to know that this isn't the end. This is the beginning, because we're not going to let this happen again." The cheers that followed were deafening. 3 months later, the first Tate Initiative Center opened its doors. It wasn't fancy, just an old repurposed community center. Walls lined with legal resources, offices for pro bono lawyers, a crisis response team for veterans who had been wrongfully detained or mistreated. But on the first day, over 200 people showed up. Malcolm stood at the entrance, shaking hands, greeting men who had been in his shoes, some worse off, some still fighting their own battles. Logan Myers, his oldest friend from the Marines, stood beside him, arms crossed. "You ever think you'd end up here?" Logan asked. Malcolm shook his head. "Not in a million years." Lisa Carter walked up, phone in hand, grinning. "You're still trending, you know." Malcolm chuckled. "Great." Jordan strolled over, tossing a folder onto the nearest table. "Well, get ready, because a senator just reached out." Malcolm raised a brow. "A senator?" "They want you to testify at a congressional hearing on police reform," she said. "They think you're the guy to push this into real legislation." He exhaled. Once, that would have been overwhelming. Now, he was ready. "Let's do it," he said. 1 year later, Malcolm stood at a podium in Washington, staring out at a room filled with politicians, reporters, and fellow veterans. He adjusted the microphone, and then, with the whole world watching, he spoke. "For too long, men like me have come home from war only to be treated like suspects instead of heroes. We swore to defend this country, and when we did, we were honored. But when we take off the uniform, the respect disappears." He met the eyes of every senator in the room. "I didn't ask for this fight," he said, "but I'm in it now, and I won't stop until something changes." As he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. But Malcolm wasn't smiling, because he knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.